Thank you for joining us today. So we recently completed a market research project assessing the evolution of payer management in oncology, and we're very happy to share with you some of the insights from that today. The research incorporated a quantitative survey with 11 payers, as well as in-depth web-assisted telephone interviews that we conducted with 9 additional payers. All respondents are from managed care organizations and pharmacy benefit management organizations, and they are all voting members of their organization's P&T committees. That being said, our survey and the interviews approached a myriad of topics around payer management in oncology. So we started as we typically do, trying to assess their overall approach and objectives of managing the therapeutic area. But then also understanding what obstacles do payers perceive are limiting them in their ability to be effective in their management strategies. We also assessed the evolving role of biosimilars in oncology, as well as more specifically, the current approach to managing non-small cell lung cancer, targeted and immunotherapies. The scope of the insights that we'll share with you today just grazes the surface of what we found and is really meant to give you an idea of some of the insights that we can share with you. So today we'll really be focusing on payers' current overall approach to oncology management, and we won't be getting into necessarily the nitty-gritty of those additional details, although we certainly can share that with you at a later date. It's also important to note that some of the results from this research were published and presented at AMCP Nexus in October 2021. So you see that there's a link in the presentation here, so you can access the poster, you can download it, you can print it. There's also a video of Johnny Clark, the lead author on the poster, as well as a presenter today who is sharing the information that was presented at AMCP. When trying to understand how payer oncology management is likely to evolve, it's really important to ground ourselves first and foremost in what is the current level of management and approach to oncology. On average, payers perceive that they have a restrained to moderate level of ability to manage oncolytics today. There was only one respondent who rated their ability to manage oncology spend as high, and that respondent is from a national managed care organization who has a lot of utilization management strategies that not every payer is currently accustomed or comfortable with implementing in oncology. So coupled with payers' perception of oncology as a priority, there is clearly a drive to focus on and identify additional opportunities to manage oncology spend with many payers, though the anticipated ability to actually invoke meaningful impact varies. So if you even just take a look at the quote there on the screen, there's one regional IDN medical director who says, "We recognize the limitations of our current ability to manage oncology spend. We can't basically exclude a drug from coverage, so how do we manage?" And so a lot of what we tried to uncover in our research today is really understanding how do they move from there. We've got this dichotomy or this challenge that payers are facing of oncology spend is increasing. They don't feel as though they have a strong ability to manage, but they're also restrained in their ability to do so. So how do we move from there? And how do we, on the other side of that, assess how payers are likely to evolve in their approach to oncology management? Among the 11 payers who participated in the quantitative survey, 8 of them are currently preferring brands in oncology. So obviously we wanted to understand what was it that drove them to prefer in those specific therapeutic categories. And that is a question that's much harder to dissect. So we put in front of them a number of different reasons to identify how are they prioritizing their attention and what is it that's influencing or impelling them to make moves and change the way that they approach oncology. Most payers focus on managing categories in oncology where there is competition and there's either a generic or a biosimilar available. So that seems to be one precondition for payers to truly identify an opportunity where they feel they can make meaningful impact and manage potential oncology spend. But the rest of the story is not as clear. Payers have historically decided to prefer an oncology as other multiple preconditions are met. So it's not a binary, if this happens, then I will prefer. there seems to be a lot of different variables. So looking at the chart on the right of the screen, increasing cost of cancer care is obviously a top reason why payers are preferring an oncology, but they're also looking towards identifying those commoditized classes of drugs, commoditized therapeutic areas, et cetera. And so, I mean, even the challenge, though, is that the ratings here are not overly differentiated. So if we go to the bottom of the chart, the second to last item, advancement of value frameworks, it has similar weight, really, on average, of influence compared to those that are higher rated. So what does that mean for you? It means that payers will assess classes of drugs, mechanisms of action, therapeutic categories one by one. And they're going to look for any opportunity that's available to them to see how many preconditions are met that give them the level of comfort to become more restrictive in that individual class or therapeutic area or indication. So while that may seem to be a non-answer, what it really means is that each unique situation must be individually assessed on a one-off basis, just the same way that the payer would be assessing the categories as well. And so with that, I would like to now introduce Johnny Clark to provide some additional insights on the payers who are not preferring an oncology, and then roll it up to understand what does all of this mean for the future management of oncology drugs.
Great. Thank you so much, Carrie. As Carrie just described, we wanted to present here also those payers that aren't currently preferring therapies within the oncology space. So we'll run through some of the top barriers to potential management in this class, as well as some of those influencers, similar to what Carrie presented before, and some of the overlap between these categories. So we see that, as is no surprise, unwillingness of pharmaceutical manufacturers to concede on pricing, whether through product WAC or ability to contract for discounts or rebates, is seen as a significant barrier in this space. It hasn't really been done to a great extent in the past, although we have seen some movement in this space recently, and it is increasing overall. In addition, there are CMS restrictions on oncology as a protected class. So for Part D coverage, you pretty much have to cover to label for related plans, or if they fit within certain guidelines, such as NCCN, and have a sufficient level of evidence, can also be covered in those instances. And another barrier here is a lack of head-to-head data between competing products. And this can be risky for manufacturers, given if the trial goes a way that they are not intending, there could be impacts negatively to their organization and product sales. And the quote here on the bottom left from a national managed care organization kind of highlights how some of these barriers need to be approached, maybe not independently, but also in tandem, considering the cost of care with these products, but also the level of evidence to support their use. And on the right here, some of the top influencers include value frameworks, such as ICER, ASCO, NCCN, which have been gaining more traction over the past few years, although we don't typically see these used a ton in payer management of oncology therapies. You may see some anecdotal responses, and we've heard through some of the interviews that some of these frameworks can be used to support negative assessments of products that can then be used to feed into contract negotiations with manufacturer partners, for instance. Also on the clinical pathway side, at the point of prescribing, this again is a huge influencer, but there are struggles with enforcing such pathways and really getting the provider network buy-in on some of the payer controls that they seek to include in such pathways. Also, the last 2 points are somewhat tied to the first barrier we discussed. What is that willingness of the manufacturer to contract, and what's the overall cost of care over time, which of course are a top concern for payers. All right, and on the next slide, we review some of the increasing management expectations for payers in the oncology space. So we found that approximately 3/4 of payers in our survey anticipate that there will be more management in the next few years. And considering some of the things that may be involved with that increase, potential contracting for preferred access is seen, as mentioned in this top right quote, by a regional plan. But there are some payers who don't really expect much change, at least within their organizations. Some prefer to stick with, for example, exclusions of products, as we've seen over the past few years with increases in those PBM exclusionary lists for oncology products over time. So we have one more slide to share with you with some of our findings from the interviews. And I won't run through all of the quotes shared here, but wanted to highlight some things related to some of the topics that we've been discussing during this presentation, including that willingness to contract, as well as pathways. So we see on some of the top left quotes here that there is interest in rebating, for example, under the medical side. However, this should also take into consideration from the manufacturer standpoint, downstream impacts to ASP and also provider net cost recovery when considering this for medical benefit products. In addition, there's mention of value-based contracts being used for CAR T therapies, of course, because they're extraordinarily expensive, but we are seeing some movement in that space regarding those kind of partnerships and pilot programs between payers and manufacturers. And finally, wanted to wrap up with additional insight as far as those pathways. So again, enforcement here can be a challenge for payers. They need to make sure their provider network is aligned, that they're able to provide recommendations that may allow them to make evidence-backed decisions on therapy for certain patients. So we have seen increased interest in pathways and some success with certain payers. But again, there is more to be done in this space, to be sure. And that'll bring us to our closing slide, where we have some of our contact information for Carrie and myself. So feel free to reach out if you have any questions at all. We also have some QR codes related to our social media if you'd be interested in checking those out. But thank you for taking the time to do this presentation, and take care.